There are seasons when you collect ideas. That's when you write your notebooks. That's when you fill your sketchbooks. That's when your mind is full of possible themes for a symphony. But then you have to somehow pare those down, see which of those have a future, which of those possibilities will live. And that's the season of patient, paced, crafted work, where you need to build upon the houses of thought, how you organize your daily life. Because if you don't have that, again, you burn out, you get discouraged.
Is the leap of faith?
Well, The Leap was the early title that I had for this book. And the notion was that it was the leap into the unknown, the leap into discovery. And that was the title that I thought would work for this book. And partly I think I wanted it because my daughter's a dancer, and I thought it would be lovely to have her on the cover.
Oh.
But it was the wrong metaphor.
You have a thing about metaphors, don't you?
Well, sure. And I thought that the leap was going to take me where I wanted to go. But the more and more I worked on the book, I realized that what I had focused on is not so much those magical moments of aha or insight, but more how a person struggles between intent and realization, how they marshal their abilities, how they connect craft with belief in themselves. And that was a much more organic, slower, both torturous and exciting process.
That's the metaphor notebook.
And the notebooks, once I had the new title, the book suddenly became real.
Vera, what caused you to crawl into the creative mind and try to determine what makes it tick?
Well, one of the things is that as a psychologist, I've always been distressed by the fact that we know so much about how to solve small problems, and so little about how people who really have enriched our intellectual lives think. So I felt that we'll never really know the human mind unless we know more about the creative mind.
You were at this for a decade, 10 years. What order of creativity sustains that kind of endurance?
Well, part of it was just that each time I interviewed somebody, it was such an exciting experience that I was nourished by the opportunity to get to know people and how they think better. I never worried about whether I'm going to finish this particular book, even though I have very frequently put it aside and done other things. So part of what nourished the book was the extraordinary fascination of not just the interviews, but to get to find how people plan their work, find notes, find letters, find the documents that, in a way, predict and help us charter where people are going in their heads and in their work. That, I think, was the source of continuity for me.
Can we talk about creativity? There is a view of creativity that it's a gift, and I think sometimes I frankly myself subscribe to that view that it can be consuming, like it almost propels a person. Does that make any sense?
Yes and no. Everybody that I have studied and interviewed and so on has a certain intensity that goes beyond the easy, comfortable way in which you want to relate to a person who cashes your checks. So there is a drivenness, there is a preoccupation, there is a living with one's task day and night that creative people have. But at the same time, if that's all they have, they last 5 years. The true lesson for me in this book is that it's knowing how to live with your intensity, not to allow it to consume you, but making sure that it gets revived each and every time when you get to work. that is the true gift of a productive person, somebody who stays creative. For
So what are you saying, that creativity has to be paced?
Absolutely. It's a very organic thing. It has its seasons. There are seasons when you collect ideas. That's when you write your notebooks. That's when you fill your sketchbooks. That's when your mind is full of possible themes for a symphony. But then you have to somehow pare those down, see which of those have a future, which of those possibilities will live. And that's the season of patient, paced, crafted work, where you need to build upon the houses of thought, how you organize your daily life. Because if you don't have that, again, you burn out, you get discouraged. So there are these rhythms, and then comes the time when you have to be able to step back and say, I didn't do this. Now I'm going to be the critic. Now I'm going to be the person who looks at this work with the eyes of a stranger. So you have that explosive period, you have the discipline period, you have the evaluative period, you have the period of anguish when you finally let it go.
Is that hard?
Very, very. Because if you really care about a piece of work, it does become your center. It's you. And to let go of anything that is so preoccupying, that's so central, is an enormous loss.
So you really do separate yourself from it.
Eventually you have to. Eventually you have to say, it has a life of its own. This novel is now on its way. Different people will react to it differently. Margaret Drabble told me that she used to be an actress, and sometimes when people read her writing and they read it wrong, it's very painful for her because she has a special way in which she hears it. Well, that's true of everything that you create. You have a special way in which you want to place it on the wall. It's a special way you want it played, but you have to be able to let go of it. It's no longer you.
Not only are you creative, you live with a creative person, Stan Steiner, your husband.
Right.
A fine novelist whom I admire and who's been on this program, as a matter of fact.
I think creative people bring the intensity and the despair to everything that they do. So I think that they probably make very good lovers sometimes, and not such good lovers at other times. That cycle, that intensity, that ability to focus on life or needing to withdraw from it affects them in their relationships just as it affects them in their work. But I wouldn't want any other kind of a lover.
I called Stan before I decided to ask you that question, and he said if the review is good to let him know. I want to talk about the diarist Anais Nin. What made her tick?
Anais Nin was an extraordinary person. I did get to know her quite well. She was the first person who encouraged me, really, besides Stan, to do this book. I think part of what made her tick is her extraordinary love of the world of the arts. There was no other important world for her. And she was not easily successful, but a very beautiful and very charming woman. She brought everything to all her gifts focused on making it possible for her eventually to be a writer of consequence. But it wasn't until she was in her 60s that she became a woman of worldwide reputation. And I think the way she sustained her momentum was every friendship, every relationship she had somehow focused on the importance of literature. She had a strong ego. Women and men in creative fields do have to believe in themselves, even if the world does not recognize them. But she did it with such grace and charm that people joined her in that belief, that people really cared for her. She always had a circle of friends around her who thought that someday she will be a famous woman. So part of it is that capacity to attract love, and then a capacity to return it, to give it.
Would that be true of somebody like Aaron Copland?
I do not know him as well as I knew Anais Nin. I think that there isn't a single profile of what keeps a creative person going. I think that particularly in the great tradition of symphony writing and of musical composition, there are a variety of sources. Part of the sources are friendships. His friendship with Harold Clurman, and I interviewed the two of them together. It was very important. But I think the other traditions, the extraordinary traditions of music themselves, and how to learn and then to teach it, how to keep that flow going, can be in a more impersonal way, also be an extraordinary source of sustained creativity. Some of it is personal, some of it is more cultural, some of it is more within the actual discipline in which you work.
The products of creative people, so often we try to infer back from them to determine who or what influenced them in the course of producing that product. You talk about it in part in terms of the notion of apprenticeship. I'm curious, are creative people conscious of the influences which work upon them in their creative activity?
I think a creative person doesn't want to be overly knowledgeable about himself or herself. During formative years, a creative person frequently knows what it is that is nourishing to that individual. It's never a cafeteria. It's never taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there. It's the ability to, like Casals describes how Bach was for him, not only when he was a very young man, but throughout his life, the necessary way of reconnecting this music each day. At first it was an apprenticeship. Later on it became daily nourishment. So apprenticeships are ways of focusing in, eliminating, going deeply into somebody else's work, but also having judgment. Having judgment and trusting your judgment, I think, is very crucial for being a creative person.
You couldn't do that, however, if you were not exposed to the work of creative people. And if what you say is true, it occurs to me that there are many people who never achieve creativity for want of exposure to the great works of science or literature or music or what it might be.
Well, you know, some of the people I talked to and some of the people I read about went very far with very little. They had a certain kind of hunger and intensity. One person, Brent Wilson, who is an art educator, lived in a small town where there were no galleries, there were no museums. All he had is Life magazine coming once a week. But what he did with Life magazine, that once a week, how that sustained him and determined and gave him determination that the first chance he had was to go and visit a gallery. So sometimes we think that in order to become creative, you have to have all the richness of human civilization. If you have a focus and an intensity, you may be able to live for a certain period of time with minimal resources. If I fully understood it, then in a way, there would be nothing else after this book. Some people actually documented how they worked on a long project. Thomas Mann pulled together all his journal entries as he was preparing for Dr. Faustus and when he wrote it. And so to some extent, we don't only have to reconstruct from a product what the influences, what the tendencies were while a person worked. Some people provided us with some amount of documentation of their own movement into a major piece of work. He talked about the magic circle, that before he started in a project, suddenly there were certain things on his table, on his desk. They were surrounding him, and they had something in common. And once he identified what they had in common, then he started a new book. So I was fortunate to find clues to the process. I didn't just have to go back from the
You're
product.
talking detective work, Vera.
That's right, that's right. You have the right term. I always said when people ask me what I really am, I say I'm the detective of the mind.
Which raises a question. What is the role of playfulness in creativity?
People who lose them, people who find that they now have to live an adult life and go on producing more and more important works and live up to their own image, who lose their connection to that childish wonder and exploration, become very narrow. You have to be able to dip back into that playfulness, that wonder, that original awe and excitement about the possibilities of leading a creative life. If you can't do that anymore, you become a craftsperson, but not a creative and productive individual. And being a craftsperson is great, but it's not the same thing.
Right. I've got to ask you, there are periods in our history where there are almost these explosions of creativity. The Renaissance is sort of like the typical example of that, which consumes the arts and the sciences, everything it touches. Is there any explanation for that?
There are periods when both in the sciences and the arts, a way of doing something has gone as far as it will go. 19th century painting, 19th century physics. And people entering the field know that they have to make a change. But they cannot make the change singly, as an individual. Braque wrote that there was a period of time when Picasso and Braque and the Cubists in general were like being chained to each other on a mountaintop. They were so preoccupied with trying to create a new way of painting, and that they were totally involved with each other. I think those are the breakthrough periods, the periods when people find each other and link their insights together and go beyond what any one individual could do alone. Once they have a new pattern, a new possibility, then they separate again. And then they work with those new possibilities alone. My sense is that that must have happened during the Renaissance. But I have more information, more detail about more recent breakthrough periods, like the Cubist period, or what the physicists did in the 20s when they were climbing mountains talking about the impossible new insights. Then they argued with each other from morning till night, and finally reached some kind of a cohesive approach to what could be done, what needed to be done next.
Which raises another question. There are those who argue that today we have sort of reached a bankrupt period in the world of ideas, that we are engineers and technicians, administrators, but that we are not creators of new ideas and new forms. One, do you buy that? And if so, why would that be?
I don't buy it. I do, of course, at times share in the despair and discouragement. I think that we are facing issues of such overwhelming magnitude that the human mind can barely encompass. I mean, being a survivor, I will never quite fully understand what I need to understand about inhumanity. So I know that to try to deal with our reality in this period of human history, whether it's the nuclear devastation, etc., I think we are frozen confronting impossibly great human tasks. And if we don't know how to deal in our art, in our science, in our understanding with what we have to deal with now, we won't survive. So I think that we are caught in an extraordinarily difficult period of time for the human mind. but a period where we have no choice but to carry on.
Vera, people like you have made it a lot more challenging to do precisely that. I've enjoyed this conversation enormously. Thank you.
I truly enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Hal Rhodes. Good night.
You know, part of why I did this book is because I live as an artist. But I think a more enduring and profound thing even than that is that I believe that if we cannot marshal our abilities to think and our abilities to more fully understand what it is to be human, then we don't have the right to enjoy the fruits of, you know, previous generations of thinkers and artists. We cannot allow ourselves to become, you know, preoccupied with trivia, with small and unimportant problems. We have no choice. We gotta continue in some form or another.